The accounts of this night are recorded by the Persians themselves in different inscriptions. And what's fascinating is that even though the Greek historians agree that there was a king of Babylon, he was feasting and he was drunk and he was killed that very night when the Persians snuck into the city, they don't give us his name. And so that was the reason why people thought Belshazzar was just a figment of Daniel's imagination. But when we understood what these cuneiform tablets were recorded, it's fascinating to see that Belshazzar was indeed the regent of Babylon. His father Nabonidus was king, but Belshazzar ruled Babylon. And that is why Belshazzar offers Daniel the third place in the kingdom, not the second place, the third place. He offered him the best he could as second in control, the third place in the kingdom. Isaiah, even 200 years before this event, describes in detail how the fall of Babylon would occur, and you can read about that in Isaiah 44, how the river would be dried up and how Cyrus's army would go in under the bridges and under the walls. And that's exactly how Herodotus describes the fall of Babylon. Even Isaiah even names the man that was going to take Babylon as Cyrus. And that was even 150 years before the man was even born. Basically, moving on quickly, chapter 6 records the lion's den, where Daniel is persecuted for the one thing that his enemies could put against him, and that was his faith. The constant prayer life of Daniel was the only thing that people could trap him on. It was his integrity. It was nothing that he was doing against the new Persians that was his prayer life that they targeted. It's interesting that the Persians, their mode of sacrifice was different to Nebuchadnezzar's. Nebuchadnezzar would throw people in fiery furnaces, but the Persians would throw people to the lion's den. And this is maybe like a little difference, but it gives us a keen insight that the man who wrote this book was an eyewitness. He was a man that lived through these times, because the Persians, we found out, worshipped fire. And to do anything other than worship fire would have been sacrilege, especially by executing people, by burning them. And so that's why they would have thrown them to the lion's den instead. The Medes and the Persians are the people that take over after the fall of Babylon, and Daniel serves them until his death. The prayer life of Daniel is exemplary. It's something that he does. Even his mode of calculating time is by the temple that no longer exists. He would pray 3 times a day. He would face west towards where the temple once stood, even though there was nothing there. And it's interesting, when you look at Daniel chapter 9, which is later on in the book, you actually find out what Daniel was praying about during this time, when they specifically targeted him, persecution. We know what it was that Daniel was praying about in chapter 9, and it was of such importance that he was not going to stop, even with the threat of death. Chapter 7 talks about basically a vision of 4 beasts and the Son of Man. The 4 beasts are basically the lion, which speaks of Babylon, the bear, which speaks of the Medo-Persians, the leopard, which speaks of the Greeks, and the 4th beast, terrifying, which speaks of Rome. These are the 4 beasts here. The initial vision that Nebuchadnezzar had was of the glory of these 4 kingdoms in precious metals. This vision is the same 4 kingdoms, but from maybe a godly perspective. You see, God reveals these 4 kingdoms to be savage and violent and terrifying. Not as gold or silver, but as beasts that are sort of out of control, or seemingly. I've explained what the symbols mean. Just skip through that. The leopard speaks of the Greeks under Alexander the Great. In this vision, the leopard has 4 heads. That speaks of the 4 generals of Alexander that would inherit the kingdom after his death. That's exactly what happened. 2 of those generals would go on to play a major part in the later prophecies in the book of Daniel, Seleucus and Ptolemy. The 4th beast speaks of Rome, as we said. Interestingly, in this chapter, though, I think, is the Ancient of Days, where Daniel sees, aside from these visions of the kingdoms, he sees, let's read in verse 9, he says, of chapter 7, he says, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, his hair on his head was pure wool, his throne was fiery flame, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came down before him, thousands and thousands served him. and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. The picture here is of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, and the man presiding it is not the high priest, as would normally be of a Sanhedrin, but is God himself. And interestingly, into this Sanhedrin, into this court, comes another person. It says in verse 13, "Behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away. His kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed." So into the Sanhedrin comes the Son of Man, to whom all glory and power and dominion is given by the Ancient of Days. And I think that's very significant. When you look at Christ and his ministry, the phrase that he uses over and over again to speak of himself is the Son of Man. And he is drawing heavily from Daniel chapter 7. The Son of Man is a messianic title. It is a title to someone that has the power and dominion of heaven itself. Something that only God can rightfully rule. Yet this is something that the Son of Man is given power over. And when Jesus uses this title, Son of Man, of himself, it's very provocative. He uses it time and time again. It's the most common phrase that Jesus uses of himself. He uses it over 80 times in the Gospels. Interestingly, in Matthew 25, we see this scene of a Sanhedrin played out again. But instead of God on the throne, there is a high priest by the name of Cephas, a man that is opposed to God, opposed to the plan of God. And this same Sanhedrin in 33 AD, meeting at night, calls into it the Son of Man. And instead of offering him the power, the dominion, the glory that is due to his name, they condemn him as a heretic, and they beat him for blasphemy. And the high priest tears his robes even at the things that Jesus says. And the reason why the high priest tears his robes is because Jesus quotes Daniel 7 of himself and says, you will see this fulfilled when I receive things that are rightfully mine, the power, the glory, the dominion. The true Sanhedrin that Christ was going to return to in heaven, where he was going to seat at the right hand of God, was denied to him on earth on his first incarnation, but will be given to him when he returns in power. So it's a very interesting insight into the way Jesus uses that title of himself and its significance, especially on the night of his arrest, when he is brought before a court, and uses that chapter to speak of himself. Chapter 8, we switch back into Hebrew language, and so from here on in, the prophecies deal repeatedly with the future of Israel and its suffering. The little horn is something that is used to speak of a powerful leader that is wholly set against God and the children of Israel. And that man is, he was, a ruler of the Seleucid Empire, which controlled Palestine in the 2nd century, a man called Antiochus Epiphanes, a man that basically caused the Maccabean revolt because of his hatred for God and the Old Testament and his enforcing of pagan idolatry in the temple and those things. Interestingly though, this character of Antiochus Epiphanes is almost a foreshadowing of a similar character that is spoken of by Jesus as going to happen in the future. And Jesus quotes things that have happened in the past by this man Antiochus Epiphanes as going to happen in the future. And he quotes those in Matthew's Gospel, and he says to look out for those things. And so when Daniel is speaking of this ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes, Epiphanes means God manifest. He considered himself God made man. He was a very violent ruler. He destroyed any copies of the Old Testament. He forbade circumcision. He offered a pig on the altar in the temple. He set up a statue of Zeus in the Holies of Holies. He was wholly set against God in the temple. And Christ speaks of a similar man that will come in the future and do those things again.